All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our speakers and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online event hosted by Asia Freedom Institute, which is a non-profit organization promoting democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, and it is my honor to welcome you all to this important panel discussion on Christianity and the persecution of Christians in China. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right, yet in China, Christians, alongside other religious communities, face harsh restrictions, state surveillance, and even persecution under the Chinese Communist Party's policies of religious control. And today we are privileged to have three distinguished experts who have dedicated their work to understanding, documenting, and advocating for religious freedom in China. Joining me, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed panelists, Bob Fu, founding president of China Aid, Sophie Richardson, co-executive director of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, and Michael Cunningham, research fellow on China at the Asia Studies Center, the Heritage Foundation. A very warm welcome to all our speakers to AFI's Freedom Hour.
Thank you.
And I would also like to inform our viewers that we have deliberately kept the bio of our speakers short so that we can have time for further discussion. But if you want to get the full bio, you can always go to AFI's website and get the full bio there. And yeah, so without further ado, I would like to begin with the first question to Bob. And before that, I would like to apologize for any inconveniences caused for our delay to all our viewers and to our speakers as well. So, Bob, my first question to you is, three Protestantism and Catholicism, along with Buddhism, Islam, and Taoism, are the five regions formally recognized by the Chinese government. According to government figures, there are 38 million Protestants and 6 million Catholics in China in 2018. Others put the number over 58 million Protestants and 12 million Catholics. Groups like Asia Harvest put the numbers even far higher. So why is there such a discrepancy in the numbers? What is the overall state of Christianity in China today, Bob?
First of all, thank you, Sakina, for having us. I'm very, very thrilled to have together with our distinguished panelists, our friends, Dr. Sophie Richardson and Michael. And the state of Christianity in China today is really in the worst persecution time since the end of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution on the one hand. And of course, the spiritual revival continues as it has happened even since the Cultural Revolution. So Xi Jinping, of course, launched a war against all the decent faiths, religious faiths, not only really to the Protestant, Christian, and the Catholicism, but all other faiths, if they show any signs of independence from the communist ideology. We're talking about the war, against the Tibetan Buddhists, the war against the Uyghur Muslims, and the war against the Falun Gong practitioners, and any other faiths actually that is not compliant with the Xi Jinping's so-called Sinicization effort that we're going to talk about later on. So we have seen the three wars were launched after Xi Jinping took power against Christians in particular, the war against the cross. Suddenly a wooden or a metal cross is declared as a national security threat, and thousands of crosses were being ordered and demolished and under force. Some were burned down from the rooftop of the church buildings. And we have seen the war against Chinese Christian leaders. Many hundreds were arbitrarily arrested under the name of national security, subversion of state power, and even criminalization of tithing and offering, a traditional practice of over 2,000 years of Christianity, was deemed as committing a fraud, a business fraud for receiving offerings. And a war against Christian children. Millions of Chinese Christian children all of a sudden were forced to renounce their faith in public. This has not happened since the Cultural Revolution. And of course, we have seen the rising revival and growth as well. And for one of the worst persecuted church in China was the early Ren Covenant Church. The pastor, who is a public legal intellectual, turned to be a house church pastor, Pastor Wang Yi, was sentenced to 9 years for preaching the Gospel of John 3:16. And he was accused of committing a crime of subversion of state power. And yet, under this brutal persecution, his church has planted 3 more churches in the past 2 years. So that's kind of the sign of growth as well.
Thank you so much, Bob. Your insights has definitely shed light on the broader struggle for religious freedom in China. Thank you so much for letting us know all about the struggles. And it also reminded me of the similar struggles faced by the Uyghurs and the Tibetan Buddhists as well, which we will delve more on later. Now, my next question is for Sophie and Bob again. I would like to begin with Sophie first. So one of the primary ways that the Chinese government maintains control over the Christian population is through the establishment of official organizations that oversee churches. For Protestants, there's the Three Self Patriotic Movement and the China Christian Council. And for Catholics, there's the Catholic Patriotic Association. So these groups make sure churches follow government rules and apply pressure on individual churches. And this system has led to many Christians worshiping in unauthorized venues known as underground churches or house churches. So can you explain this architecture of control, the scale of underground churches and other controls and measures put in place by the CCP and Chinese authorities to control and restrict Christianity in China? Sophie, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Sakina. It's lovely to be here with you and to be with friends of many, many years and new friends too, talking about this important topic. I think maybe one way to answer that question is to recall that under international human rights law, the freedom of religion or belief is one that's held by individuals. It is not a right that governments get to give or take away. And I think I want to make that point because I think it's foundational to understanding the extraordinary architecture of control that you're asking about that the Chinese government and the party put in place. And really sort of the most fundamental way that control is exercised is through the designation in Chinese law of 5 particular religions and limiting worship to normal practices within those religions as defined by the state. So one of the ways that quite a few Protestant denominations, underground churches in particular, are quite vulnerable is that they are deemed abnormal. And if you are deemed abnormal, then you are essentially operating outside the confines of the law. As is the case with many aspects or many ways that the Chinese government seeks to constrain rights, is to make that designation to say your conduct is abnormal, it's outside the law, but using these very vague terms. And so it's very difficult for people to even know whether they're somehow violating what particularly local authorities decide is and isn't acceptable. But then in cases like, for example, I'm glad Bob has raised the case of Pastor Wang Yi, who was sentenced to 9 years on charges of inciting subversion, right? Which is a very serious charge under Chinese law. This is a case that I think highlights so clearly what happens to communities that are knowingly operating outside the confines of things like the patriotic churches or normal religious activity, and the kinds of sentences that they can face. They're very harsh persecutions, and the Chinese government invests significant resources in limiting these communities and shutting them down, in ways that range from those kinds of baseless prosecutions all the way through to the confiscation of property or assets, criminalizing printing or selling or sharing religious texts, but also by retaining the right. The Chinese government gives itself the right to decide, who can be a faith leader in a particular community, what constitutes a normal practice, what a regular congregation ought to look like. And, all of these practices are wildly in tension with international law. So hopefully that gives some sense really of the risks that people are forced to take in exercising this very individually held, or this individually held right.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for your perspective. Bob, let's hear your perspective on this.
Yes, I totally agree with the overall assessment, especially under the international legal structure on religious freedom by Sophie. I think the Communist Party has become an arbitrator of people's religious faith and its practice when it's deemed as normal, when it's deemed as abnormal, when it's deemed as legal, when it's deemed as illegal. So you have seen one of the ways the Communist Party tried to control and monitor is through this so-called patriotic religious organizations. I mean, I would say that these so-called 5 patriotic religious organizations are nothing but Communist Party controlled political organization just with a religious uniform. I mean, they are the total puppets of the Communist Party. Just this week, actually, March 13th, after the so-called the 2 sessions, the People's Congress and the Political Consultation Conference on March 13th in Beijing, and the United Front Working Department, Communist Party leader, and the National Director of State Religious Affairs Administration, and they convene a national conference, basically, again, pressure and manage these so-called patriotic leaders, attended by the president of the Protestant so-called TSPM, Three Self-Patriotic Movement leader, and the Chinese Catholic Bishop of Conference of the Catholic Patriotic Association president. And they all have to make a vow to pledge their absolute allegiance to Xi Jinping's thoughts and with socialist so-called ideals, and adhere to the absolute loyalty to the socialism ideals, and again the banner of Sinicization. So if the Communist Party, as an atheistic party, has the authority to deem one religion who is orthodox, who is kind of cultic, and in different religions, who is an evil religion, who is not evil religion, then the so-called freedom of practicing their manifestation of their faith according to the international law, and even according to the Article 36 of the Chinese own constitution, are totally violated. And the CCP even designated 14 so-called religions or religious organizations. And I kind of recognize at least 8 to 10 of these 14 are associated with the Protestant Christian faith, one way or another. Some may a little bit, theologically, we call it heretical, but how can you, as a state, designate them as a state, designate the evil cause, and thus a subject for tremendous persecution? I mean, just the same level of persecution like what Falun Gong practitioners had been experiencing. I mean, on just last Christmas Day, the 10 of the Christian leaders in Tibet were indicted and sentenced. I mean, indicted, not formally sentenced yet, for simply being house church missionaries there for 15 years. We have seen some church leaders in Sichuan province were even received 12, 14 years for reading John Calvin's Institute of Christian Religion. I mean, these are like the almost like the Orthodox version of Protestantism, of mass reading literature by the Presbyterian Church around the globe, and yet they are deemed as evil cult. 12 years, 14 years imprisonment for the two female church leaders in Sichuan. So these are the issues I think the Communist Party are trying to manipulate to its absolute control on the Christian faith in China.
Sakina, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Sophie and Bob. And I think that it becomes clear that the state-controlled religious organizations and restrictions are driving many Christians underground. And this is only highlighting the ongoing struggle for religious freedom in China. Thank you so much. My next question is for Michael, and it's also for Sophie, but let's begin with Michael. The persecution of Christians is part of a broader policy of religious repression in China. So what are the key similarities and differences in how the CCP targets different religious communities like Christians, the Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners? How is the Chinese Communist Party co-opting religion? Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me on this program, Sakina. So I would say the Uyghurs, I mean, Bob has done a great job of explaining what a lot of Christians are dealing with in China. And I would say the Uyghurs and Tibetans are on a different level altogether. And there are reasons for that. So if we look at, what is driving these policies by the CCP, it's really paranoia. It's paranoia of any organization that the CCP does not control, and any links to foreigners, foreign communities, and so, whether they're financial links or ethnic, cultural links or leadership links or whatever. And so in the case of Xinjiang and Tibet, this isn't just religion that they're paranoid of, but also, it's an ethnic identity in addition to a religious identity. So, and they also happen to be border regions, and they have ethnic and cultural affinity to groups on the other side of the border. And so, the CCP is constantly, and it's not just these policies, but basically everything it does, it is driven by its obsession with maintaining its own power in China. And so that's really what's driving it. And so, for Christians, Christians are embedded in mainstream Han culture for the most part. And so, on the one hand, not as risky from the CCP's perspective. They don't worry, for example, about separatism. But on the other hand, they are embedded throughout mainstream culture, and so it is a risk on that side. But at the same time, the CCP sees it as an opportunity. These are groups that have moral authority. There's something beyond just the government is telling me to do it. If they can get these religions to help sponsor the CCP and its authority, well, that's just it just adds to their power. And so I would say, like I said, I think Bob and Sophie have done a good job of laying out what Christians are dealing with in China. I would say, some people might be listening to this who are Christians in China or who come from China and might think, well, that wasn't my experience. And there's a reason for that, is that in China, for the most part, most of your experience as a Christian is going to depend on where you live, what church you're a part of, and what your relationship is, your church's relationship, what it is with the local authorities who are really the ones enforcing the government's policies. And so, up till a couple years ago, I even knew Christians in China that believed that things were getting better, whereas other Christians felt like things were getting much worse. I don't really hear anyone today saying things are getting better. That, I think, has changed. But I guess I would say that even those Christian congregations, those churches that have a good relationship with their local authorities, all it takes is one phone call from a neighbor complaining about, there are a lot of people singing every Sunday or something like that, or a resident who has realized that the government is now offering incentives if you rat out illegal religious organizations. All it takes is one of these, and then the local authorities, who are, primarily driven by paranoia of losing their own position, all it takes is one such complaint, and regardless of how good your relationship is with the authorities, you're out.
Thank you so much, Michael, for letting us know about how the Christians are living this kind of life in China, and letting us know about how their life is always surveilled daily. Thank you so much, Michael. Sophie, let's hear your perspective on this.
Sure. Let me start by saying that I think when governments make certain kinds of information hard to get at or censor it, it's a very worrying sign from a human rights perspective. And maybe someday we will have the full data sets to be able to answer the core of your question, which is to be able to distinguish between how different communities, whether those are different faith communities, whether they're different ethnic communities, how they are targeted for repression by the authorities. I think it is broadly true that Uyghurs and Tibetans tend to be prosecuted on charges of separatism, of terrorism, of subversion. They're not the only people who are targeted for that, but often their religious activity is construed or characterized in that way for the purposes of prosecution. Where I think for Christians, we tend to see, and again, I'm speaking in very broad terms here, the use of charges like organizing a cult, for example, or illegal business activities. Maybe I can just say that a few weeks ago, CHRD published a report that looked at patterns of sentencing of people who had, really done nothing more than either exercise their own human rights or advocate for better respect by the state for human rights. And it looked specifically at the period of 2019 to 2024, drawing on our own database, but also looking at others too. And one of the findings was that we looked to see particularly which charges were most frequently used. Picking quarrels and stirring up trouble came in first for this group of about 1,500 people. But the second one was the charge of using a cult to undermine implementation of the law. Now, if somebody can actually tell me what that means, I'd like to know. It's one of these kinds of charges that's incredibly vaguely defined. But we tracked about 75 cases in that period of that subset of 1,500. And many of those cases were brought forward essentially drawing on Article 300 of the criminal law that suggests that doing things like holding assemblies is somehow illegal. Now, reconcile that against the Chinese government's obligations under international law to respect the freedom of assembly. Doing things like producing flyers or disseminating books to some unspecified number of recipients are clearly in tension, not only with Article 35 of the Chinese Constitution, but again, with internationally guaranteed rights to free speech. But these are some of the kinds of charges that are used against people. And our research showed that the average sentence for people prosecuted on these charges was 3 to 7 years. That's a significant period of time. And again, within this subset, about a dozen of the people with the cases that we looked at had been prosecuted on charges of illegal business activity. And it's the very arbitrary nature of these charges, and the extraordinary challenges of trying to mount a defense in a legal system that is heavily stacked against defendants. That makes it very easy for the government to simply, decide that certain behavior constitutes violation of the law and shut it down. And maybe I want to make sure to raise at least one particular case that I think is, really fits into the frame of this discussion. And that is a guy named Banyan Chao, who in April of this year, got a 5-year sentence, again, on charges of illegal business activity, simply for printing and selling Bibles, which is not illegal under the law, unless it's classified as abnormal. And again, the state just gives itself enormous latitude to decide what behavior isn't acceptable and prosecute people.
Thank you so much, Sophie and Michael, for shedding light on this crucial issue. The systematic approach reveals that religious repression in China is not just about control, it's about eliminating independent thought. Thank you so much. My next question is intended to all our speakers, and I would like to start off with Bob. So, Bob, Xi Jinping has called for the sanitization of religions, and this policy has greatly restricted the religious freedom of Muslims in East Turkestan and Buddhists in Tibet. So, what form has this policy of sanitization taken with regards to Christians in China? Can you share some specific examples and incidents? Also, how have policies and persecution of Christians worsened under Xi Jinping? Bob?
Yeah, the sanitization is nothing but a forced kind of almost you can call it fascification. It's basically like Hitler's time. You impose this state ideology to make your faith compatible with this ideology. Anyone or any faith or group that refuse to do so would be subject for persecution. And under this banner to the Christianity, we have seen the government even attempted, at least in the declared mission, to retranslate a new version of the Bible according to the socialism characteristics with the Chairman Xi Jinping's thoughts. We have not seen the complete translation yet, but that is one way they want to change even the core of your faith. Number two, they of course target Chinese children. So anybody under 18 years old, any student, any civil servants who dare to go to a church or a religious site would be subject for severe punishment and penalty. And that's why I see we have received documentation showing the millions, not hundreds of thousands, millions of just Christian children were singled out, being surveyed from the school first, and then one by one, they were taught, instructed to sign a Communist Party prepared form to renounce their faith in public by with their teachers and the parents on the side. If they don't do that, their parents' jobs are in jeopardy. Their even grandparents' social welfare would be removed. We have seen these kind of examples. And of course, those religious, clergymen, you talk about Protestant pastors, Catholic bishops and fathers, and the Muslim imams in the mosque, and Buddhist monks. They were all forced to, in public, declared they have to become so-called Xi Jinping's monks, patriotic monks. Suddenly the Communist Party's Religious Affairs Bureau official, the United Front Working Department officials, the Ministry for Public Security officials has become the clergyman's license arbitrator. So can you imagine, a pastor is being examined by an atheistic Communist Party ideologue and said, unless you pledge and sign these forms, pledge your allegiance to the communism, socialism ideology, you are not allowed to be licensed to lead your congregation. That's why, those many Catholic bishops are being forcibly removed, and some are still missing and arrested. I know we're going to talk about this later on, but these are the examples showing how this so-called Sinicization campaign has run and continue to run deep. Even Protestant pastors who are arrested for some were for simply going to Malaysia, attending ordinary Bible exposition conference. And as Sophia just pointed out, their Bibles are not allowed to be publicly distributed. We have a 70-year-old Christian lady, Wang Honglan, from Inner Mongolia. She was being arrested and still under arbitrary detention for nearly 3 years for simply, with her own money, distributing Bibles, hundreds of thousands of copies of Bibles, and facing a major criminal sentence with her husband and other Christian leaders in her congregation. So if this is happening, on the continuously, I don't think anyone can claim there is any religious freedom left in China.
Thank you so much, Bob. And of course, it becomes quite ridiculous that the atheist Chinese Communist Party is taking control of the religious community in China. Michael, let's hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to follow up on something Bob said about this so-called Sinicization. It's not Sinicization. It's exerting CCP control. So this is, I think, a really important distinction because Christianity is very conducive to traditional Chinese culture, very much. Being Christian doesn't make anyone less Chinese. In fact, I love going to Christian churches throughout the world and just seeing the local flair of how they bring their own cultures and cultural identities into it. A religion is always internalized, sort of based on the lived experience of the individual, and so yeah, Chinese Christians are very Chinese. So what is China really doing? It's trying to co-opt Christianity, co-opt religion, essentially, and it's trying to make people feel like if they don't give the CCP control, then somehow they're stooges of foreign imperial powers, which isn't at all the case. Actually, the CCP leadership is in many ways not conducive to Chinese culture, which is one of the reasons they've had such trouble exerting their control. But what does this so-called sinicization mean in practice? I think Bob basically gave a really good overview of it. I mean, it can really, once again, it depends on who the local authorities are, what they feel like they have to do to comply, or what, some of them are just very forward-leaning, very excited to crack down. But for the most part, they're, doing what they think they, what they think they need to do to comply. And so it could be anything from removing crosses to forcing churches to hang pictures of Xi Jinping. It could be cracking down on people selling Bibles, for example. It could be something, as minor as frequently catching up with leaders, taking them out to tea, or it could be something like forcing churches to take your preference or the government's preferences into account when it comes to choosing their pastors or their leadership. And that's really, that's quite ridiculous. If you think about it, I can't think of a single business that would allow a foreign government to choose their executives in a foreign country, let alone a religious organization allowing an atheistic regime to have a say in who they have preaching at the pulpit.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I really like the term exerting the CCP control. Yeah, thank you, Michael. Sophie, let's hear your perspective on this.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just add that I think it's a very common tactic of authoritarian regimes to try to dictate the terms of identity and loyalty and patriotism, and to circumscribe what a good citizen looks like. And it's not hard to see how the party and the current leadership in China drew on new religious regulations that were put in place in April of 2016 to apply or meld the concept of sinicization to the practice of religion, both to Christians and to other faiths too. But I think there's a broader agenda in Xi Jinping's mind about what an acceptable citizen today on some level thinks, and how they behave, and sort of their outward expressions of identity. And I think you can see this on issues ranging from what constitutes acceptable religious practice to a push for women to leave the workforce and resume more traditional roles. And I think these are very dangerous ideas that get co-opted, particularly in times of economic slowdowns and when other forms of repression haven't worked, to say that the fate of our country depends on people assuming a very particular identity. And sinicization is sort of a rallying cry that also ties into Xi's ideas about the China dream and sort of regaining a place of prominence in history and drawing on all sorts of cultural reference points, but also in saying that these forms of identity, in the case of this conversation about faiths the authorities don't like, are not acceptable. So I think those pathologies are not just about religion; they're about other expressions of who people are and a society that's changed enormously in recent years. But also, it's the party's way of saying this is acceptable behavior and that is not. Whether it's about faith, whether it's about employment, whether it's about other aspects of life.
Thank you so much, Sophie. My next question is for Bob. Bob, your organization, China Aid, has been at the forefront of documenting and exposing religious persecution in China. So, can you briefly introduce the work of China Aid? What are the organization's core goals and objectives? And how is your organization promoting religious freedom and bringing about change in China? Bob.
Yeah, thank you. As a former prisoner of faith, being jailed for leading a Bible study group in Beijing and underground church school, I have first-hand experience basically how the lack of religious freedom damaging the civil society in China. As Sophie and Michael just pointed out, I mean, the Communist Party always tried to drive a wedge, try to divide the Chinese people, that by claiming, one more Christian, one less Chinese, that's totally political propaganda. I mean, when even the history of Christianity in China shows that the contextualization of our faith in the Chinese culture has been very deep. I mean, and the Chinese Christians has been really one of the best citizens in the civil society. They are taught and practice to care the poor, the needy, the vulnerable. When the Wenchuan, like a Sichuan earthquake happened, it was the group of underground Chinese Christians led by now, being sentenced to 9 years, Pastor Wang Yi from his own province, for the first, even the rescuers coming into the earthquake areas, and how could the Chinese Communist Party continue this way? So after my wife and I were exiled to the U.S., we just feel like at least, in a free society in the U.S., we can speak up and as a voice for those voiceless, and provide some technical and humanitarian support for those who are arbitrarily imprisoned for their faith, and provide some biblical worldview and even legal defense and rule of law trainings. So these are the kind of goals, missions of China Aid. We are committed to work with the persecuted by advancing religious freedom for all faiths. And we do this by exposing the abuses of the persecution, by speaking up, like in your platform, and working with those like-minded international organizations, like for years with Dr. Sophia Richardson and Michael with the Heritage and the Freedom House and others. And by also helping specifically by providing financial relief and even biblical literature. And in some cases, we have to do the rescue work for those who are facing life and death threats. The year before, we rescued over 64 Christian church members from Shenzhen, a church known as Mayflower Church, after they escaped from the persecution, and they were kidnapped and arrested in Bangkok, Thailand. We rallied the international community, and by the grace of God, with the help of the Biden administration, State Department, all of the 64 were rescued to the United States. They're now living in our community peacefully and can practice their faith, and even gave birth to 3 more Made American children. So we also provide legal defense for those human rights lawyers who defend for religious freedom cases, and rule of law trainings we also provide. So these are what China Aid has been doing in the past 22 years since our founding.
Thank you so much, Bob, for sharing the work of China Aid. Your efforts in advocating for religious freedom are truly impactful and vital for those facing repression in China. Thank you, Bob. And my next question is there any difference in the situation between the Protestants and Catholics in terms of what members of the two faith communities are having to endure and how the authorities deal with them respectively? Given that Catholics believe in the authority of the Vatican, are they viewed as a greater threat or problem? Bob.
Well, certainly, I mean, on the level of the faith, if they are independent faith, no matter is Catholic practitioners or Protestant practitioners, they were treated as the same, the level of under the same kind of Communist Party's religious policy, under the same Sinicization right now order. But practically, I guess the because of the Vatican have a pope, and also the Vatican is the only Western European country that recognize the country of Taiwan. Taiwan is the only embassy in Europe is in the Vatican. So there is some diplomatic issue. I think politically, the Communist Party certainly treats the Catholic Church in a different category. I think that's why many Vatican appointed independent bishops in the Chinese Catholic Church has been under so much more severe persecution since the founding of the People's Republic of China under communist control. Some were vanished, some are still not being found for decades. And as recently as last week, the independent bishop in Wenzhou are being arrested again. And so those, despite of the goodwill, so-called gestures by the Vatican, I don't think the Communist Party has treated them fairly. Certainly, we're going to talk about this issue about the so-called secret deal, right? So the Protestant churches, we don't have a pope, but the communist government used their so-called patriotic organizations and the arbitrary definition of so-called evil cult. I mean, are all the measures to exercise this persecution. I think Sophia alluded that the definition, the authority of the definition of evil cult has been vastly expanded under the new religious law. I mean, in the past, only the central government has the authority to designate an evil cult. And now, under the new regulations, religious regulations, even the provincial level religious affairs officials and the Public Security Bureau officers, are allowed to designate their own so-called evil cult organizations. And we actually counted over 3 dozens of Communist Party government institutions have the authority to manage religious affairs. And now, from the youth league organizations to the women's federation to even the earthquake detection institution have some say to a church building, whether they are allowed to gather or not. So the Communist Party expanded vastly the number of authorities from both central government now to the local levels to strictly so-called manage religion according to the new document on March 13th. The Communist Party spread it among the patriotic religious institutions under its control.
Thank you so much, Bob, for this detailed information. And my next question is for all the speakers, and I would like to start off with Michael. In 2018, China and the Vatican signed a provisional agreement on the appointment of bishops, and where the Pope has the final say in the appointment of bishops for the Catholic Church throughout mainland China. The agreement, which has never been made public, was renewed for the third time in October 2024. How is this agreement working out, Michael?
Yeah, well, they certainly face a lot of criticism because of it. I'm not going to criticize them, and the reason I won't is because every religious organization is doing the best it can to deal with the circumstances in China, and I don't know what's in this agreement. They renewed it for the third time. They clearly see some value in it, but I don't have a clue what's in it or if it's working out. I can say what it appears is that it's not working out very well. And the reason I say that is, I mean, first of all, it does seem to have, in many people's minds, put a dent in their moral authority. But, China constantly violates the agreement. What we know about the agreement, at least, which is that, at least what we think we know, which is that, the Vatican has the authority, the authority to say, to veto a leadership that Beijing tries to put up, and that Beijing isn't supposed to appoint bishops without going through the Vatican, and yet that happens pretty consistently since they signed the agreement. The other thing I'd say is that my understanding, having talked with various Christian organizations, is that other churches were looking with keen interest at the Vatican-Beijing negotiations that resulted in this agreement. And I haven't really seen other religions, other churches follow in their footsteps. It doesn't seem that the other religions that were so interested in this deal have found it to be something to emulate. I think the general consensus is that it isn't working out too well for them.
Thank you so much, Michael. Sophie, let's hear your perspective on this.
Thanks. I have no trouble being more critical of the Vatican on this matter. I think its unwillingness to weigh in on behalf of persecuted Catholics for decades is deeply disturbing. And most recently, as it has pursued this arrangement to not speak up about everybody from people like Cardinal Zen in Hong Kong or Jimmy Lai, who not only are unable to lead their faiths or practice their faith the way they want, but that's known, right? We can all see that and know that and read about it in the news. And I think it certainly leaves a perception that the Vatican is more interested in pursuing some kind of a deal for which, as Michael has just suggested, there's not a lot of evidence that's playing out in a way that would, expand the rights to religious freedom or better guarantee the rights to religious freedom of people in that faith. And I think we have all seen major institutions and governments, companies, powerful actors consistently give away opportunities to articulate a demand that the Chinese Communist Party behave in ways that are in conformity with, from my perspective, international human rights law, but whether it's business ethics or other standards, in pursuit of some sort of a deal for themselves. And in doing so, I think wind up abandoning some of their own community members who most need their defense. And I think it's been very disappointing that the Vatican has not vociferously defended people like, for example, priests who were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, who spent most of their adult lives in jail simply for trying to, carry out their work as part of their faith the way the Vatican says it wants. And that's distressing. And we've just seen that game fail again and again and again and again over decades. And it would be good to see the Vatican really speak up very strongly about the abuses of Catholics and other faiths across the country.
That was an interesting one. Thank you so much, Sophie, for your perspective. Bob, let's listen to your perspective on this.
Well, I'm not going to be as diplomatic as Michael, and I like Sophia's. Let's talk to the truth. Talk the truth of the matter. I think. I mean, the secret deal for whatever it is, whatever is motivation, at least on just judged by the result, is a miserable failure. I mean, it does not really prevent the arbitrary arrest of the independent-minded Catholics who adhere to the biblical teaching and to the Vatican's instruction. And I think Nina Shea from the Hudson Institute has documented just in the past couple of months, at least over 15 bishops are still missing or arrested or sentenced. And we have seen, as Sophia just pointed out, the Vatican has fallen into total silence on the arrest of, the crackdown, the violence against the peaceful protesters in Hong Kong, and the arbitrary arrest of those Catholic followers like Jamie Lai, and many others. We know, and also the appointment of bishops, as Michael even pointed out. The deal was supposed to let the Vatican have the final say, but it allowed the Communist Party to have the first filter to nominate the first. They have the authority. The Communist Party has the authority to nominate a candidate for a qualification of a Catholic clergyman. I mean, that itself couldn't work. It has not worked. And also, I'm disappointed that many other very clear-cut moral issues, the Vatican chose to be silent, even chose to be sided with the Communist Party's propaganda. I give you an example about the horrible practice of the organ harvesting. I think Sophie, Michael, you remember the organ harvesting practice has been internationally already verified, by the London-based independent tribunal, it has been documented with irrefutable evidence by many cases as well. And yet, it was the Vatican who called for a conference held in Rome some years ago, and invited the China's top kind of official who oversee the organ transplant, organ harvesting, the Minister of Chinese Health, and had a total propaganda, one-sided conference, and even reached a conclusion, concurred by the Vatican officially, that China's organ transplant practice is totally normal, totally ethical, everything is fine. So this is outrageous, I think, to all the Catholic practitioners. So I just, can't believe this is done by the supposedly a very top, the word moral authority, the Vatican Church, and the the officials over there can sign up on this. So these are the issues I have. I mean, I have not hiding, my views, but we certainly want the Vatican deal to be successful. Maybe the first step is to reveal the secret deal, like what kind of secret are there, if they can let it shine some lights. I hope so.
Thank you so much, Bob, for letting out your view regarding Vatican. My next question is again intended to all speakers. Michael, I would like to start with you. Pope Francis has made China one of his top priorities and has made many overtures to China and Xi Jinping personally. Most Vatican watchers, a papal visit to China has long been the wish of Pope Francis and the Vatican. The Pope is currently in poor health. So, can you share your thoughts on China and Vatican ties? Has Pope Francis's pro-China approach worked? Is a papal visit to China a possibility in the near future? Of course, it should be noted that the Vatican is one of the only 12 countries in the world that still recognize Taiwan. Michael, what's your view on this?
Okay, so the Vatican's interest in China, I think, long preceded Pope Francis, and it'll likely endure after he's gone. That, I believe, back as far as 2007, I think there were even talks, probably even before that. But I remember in 2007, quite a few talks about, is the Vatican trying to establish diplomatic relations with China? And so, I would say, this isn't a new issue. A papal visit to China, I think, isn't outside the realm of possibility, but of course, Pope Francis would have to, his health would have to improve before I think that would happen. But I would say, I guess the bigger question is, how far will these Vatican-China ties go? Will there be recognition at some point, diplomatic relations? I would say that seems to be a far ways off. It's not definitely a short-term possibility, but I would be more concerned about that in the medium to longer term. If that did happen, Catholics in Taiwan wouldn't really be directly affected, but Taiwan would take a huge diplomatic hit. It's very important for them to have the Vatican as their one diplomatic partner in Europe. Not to mention just the moral authority that having ties with the Vatican, or that diplomatic partner seems to instill. I would say, the agreement seems to sort of be the first step in the process. If we were to look at it sort of as a progression towards formal ties between the Vatican and China, I would say a papal visit would probably be the second step. And then, if they established a permanent representative office in China, and potentially China in the Vatican as well, then that would probably be mean that diplomatic recognition is a lot closer. I would say I think the Vatican has a lot more to lose than to gain if it ever does formalize diplomatic relations with China. I would recommend that they look at the experiences of other countries that have dropped Taiwan in favor of ties with China. Costa Rica being a great example, where they turned to China for all these promises of investment, and then Chinese investment plummeted afterwards. So I do think that, in the current state where we've just explored that the Vatican doesn't really have a very good deal with China, but probably this is the best it will be, because it does not have formal ties with China, and Beijing has the impression that, well, that is a distinct possibility we are working in that direction. And so I think now Beijing has more of an incentive to play nice than it would have if they actually did formalize the relationship.
Thank you so much, Michael. Sophie, let's hear your perspective on this.
I guess I have two thoughts to share. One is that I think the Chinese government's and the Communist Party's hostility to organized religion is generally about those as alternative organizing vehicles for people, as ways of creating communities, some of which pledge their adherence to non-PRC entities. And just listening to Michael talk now, I was thinking about Beijing's perception of the Vatican relative to its perception of other faith-based organizations or bodies, governing bodies that themselves have a strong faith identity component. For example, the Tibetan government seated in Dharamsala. That it's interesting to think about Beijing's different perspectives on those different kinds of bodies. I struggle to imagine Beijing being very enthusiastic about giving some external body some authority over what happens to people inside the country. And I think any deal, as Michael has suggested, is one that would fall far below what should be articulated. There aren't necessarily international standards on these kinds of agreements, but to cede authority over decisions about texts and clergy, physical facilities, many aspects of a religion, to an authoritarian government that's profoundly hostile to organized religion seems a pretty bad deal. I think Beijing's interest in the Vatican is really in keeping with its commitment to exerting control over and subverting, for its own purposes, international organizations. I think there's a way in which this isn't necessarily about Catholicism per se, or even necessarily about religion as such, but rather, I think some of the behavior we've seen Beijing express towards the Vatican is somewhat similar to the way we've seen Beijing try to undermine, for example, international human rights institutions. To sort of enter into a discussion to say, we want to try to find some sort of happy medium, and then a lot of concessions wind up getting made, or lines not being held within those international bodies, and the standards are lower. And I would be concerned about that with respect to the fate of Catholics in China, both ones who worship within the state-approved church, but also ones who worship outside it. The Vatican does not have a strong track record defending those people against the party's repression.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Bob, let's hear your perspective.
Well, I think number one, with the Chinese Communist Party's military airplanes and ships are encircling Taiwan almost on a daily basis, threatening them a peaceful island with 23 million people there. It would be an absolute betrayal if the Vatican chose to to brand these diplomatic relations with Beijing by ditching Taipei. I think it's not only the morally wrong, but geopolitically it will be a disaster. I think you basically put the Vatican in the under the column sided with the dictators, with the tyrants like Xi Jinping. In the context of the the worst religious persecution time since the Cultural Revolution, including the Catholic Church, as we just mentioned. Number two, I think my humble admonition as a Christian brother is, the Bible teaches to cling to what is good, to hate what is evil. I think it's time for the whoever the the future Pope or the current Pope Francis, maybe to learn a little bit history from the Pope John Paul, right, who was credited as one of the good forces that really remove the threat of communism in Eastern European countries, and to have some moral clarity to which side is the Catholic Church, the Vatican really standing on in this history, when the CCP is deemed as the most kind of important existential threat to the democratic values and our way of life today, by all the law enforcement, intel, and societies across the free world. So I just hope and really pray that Vatican can do the right thing.
Thank you so much, Bob. Now, my last question is, I just want to know how can the international community help or support with the issue of religious freedom in China and help mitigate the struggles that the religious communities are facing right now in China? Michael, let's start this with you.
Yeah, so for interest of time, I will just give really brief thought, which is, the international community really just needs to it needs to come together. Governments need to raise these issues when they talk with their Chinese counterparts. It's really important. In particular, the United States, the bully pulpit, as it's called, really, it's not always effective, but it's essential. And if that doesn't exist, then it there's not much we can do. And so that, I think, is very important. Of course, not just the United States, but leading countries generally. And I think we need to support governments and countries that defend religious freedom, and we need to find ways as civil society to support religious organizations and help them, find more creative ways to support the Chinese Christians, Chinese religious organizations. We have to remember that they do have to be Chinese, and much of what they're doing, we need to make sure that we don't hurt them more by trying to help them, and communication is a good way to make sure we don't do that. But that's what I would say briefly.
Thank you, Michael. Sophie, let's hear your perspective.
Sure, I too will be very brief. Maybe just remind everybody what Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says. And this is a treaty that the Chinese government has signed but not yet ratified, so it is expected to uphold it. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And it is critical not only to press the Chinese government to live up to those standards, but for all democratic governments to fulfill that standard themselves. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Bob?
Well, I would really point out that the today's platform, with both Sophie and Michael speaking up for religious freedom, for the persecuted faithful in China in itself, is a good example. I mean, basically showing the solidarity of support for those who are persecuted. It will provide the comfort and support for those Christian prisoners, like Pastor Wang Yi, like many others. Even though maybe they are not listening to this, and you never know who will share it with them. I know Pastor Wang Yi has over 1,100 prayer points. So every day, if you go through 1,100 prayer lines, that takes a lot of time. I guess he's not very idle with idle time in his prison. And number two, I think besides the international solidarity for our governments, especially those free world governments that we proclaim that religious freedom is our first freedom. And as Sophia pointed in from the very beginning, that religious freedom is not a given kind of imputed right by any government or political institution or authority. It is a God-given freedom. So I think if it is a first freedom, and that puts the obligation, I think, for those democratic countries, from America, North America to the European countries, to lift up these values, when to speak up. I mean, Sophie and I, we kind of join hands together. We walk into the White House, walk into the State Department, from George W. Bush time to Obama's time to the President Trump's time. I mean, I think the bully pulpit does speak volumes to those dictators, because if our elected top leaders are silent or even not prioritize our first freedom in their bilateral or multilateral relations with China, with their counterpart, the Communist Party leaders, and then that sent a wrong signal. That sent a message that we are not caring as much as our business connections, over other issues of concern or trade. I think it's not partisan to see that if our president invite those prisoners of conscience, especially those who are able to escape to the free world, to the White House, to the presidential palaces, to the Capitol Hill, in the parliament, to speak up, to even have a photo op. I mean, we all know, I mean, the CCP is watching. That will send a strong signal. And finally, I think, multiple governments already passed the similar version of the Magnitsky, the Global Magnitsky Act, right, for the accountability. So it's time, I think, to exercise that, to put real sanctions on those perpetrators. I mean, like even the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, not only highlighting the victims of religious persecution, but those perpetrators, those persecutors, they should be held accountable. They should be pointed out. They should be ashamed in the public arena. I mean, to put their names there, that they have violated not only their Chinese own constitution, but of course the international mechanisms, the laws, the universal declarations. So I think that will make a difference. So I remembered then when President Trump invited this group of religious prisoners from Uyghur Tibetan Christian Catholic communities to the Oval Office, led by the former ambassador Sam Brownback. And initially, it was supposed to be like just a photo op for 10 minutes. It lasted for more than an hour. And when everybody was able to share their stories, and it really make the difference. I know one of the participants from a persecuted church from Guizhou. Immediately, the public security went to the talk to the family members of that persecuted church. I mean, you could say at least they are watching. I mean, maybe you can't see the immediate good or positive result, but at least they are watching. I just use this illustration. I mean, the same night after that meeting in the Oval Office, the Communist Party, the public security immediately worked their way. I mean, start responding. So that's my point. I think it's important that both the civil society and the government to act together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing your expertise today. The conversation has shed light on the complex and ongoing challenges surrounding religious freedom in China. And we really appreciate your contributions. I really appreciate your patience as well for today's conversation. Thank you so much once again. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And we hope this discussion further sparks dialogue and action on this critical issue. Before I end, I would like to say that the video of the session will be uploaded on AFI's website at www.asiafreedominstitute.org. And please follow AFI's social media platforms for more information and activities on Asia Freedom Institute, and we are also available both on Apple Podcast and YouTube. Thank you so much once again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zakina.